The Washington Commanders are truthfully one of the weirdest teams in the entire NFL. Despite having some very competitive games against the Philadelphia Eagles, they recently just got absolutely embarrassed by Dallas on Thanksgiving, and as a whole on the entire season, they've had some really good victories and some very good games, and then some really bizarre losses. They'll go in there and compete with a team like the Seattle Seahawks, and they'll go out there and compete with the Philadelphia Eagles, but then they'll get smoked by a team like the Chicago Bears, and they'll lose 2 games to the New York Giants, one with Tommy DeVito. So are the Washington Commanders one of the brighter futures in the NFL, or should we be concerned about their future? Well, I'm going to answer those questions plus some more about this Washington Commanders team, but without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into this team. Now, whenever I talk about individual teams, I like to briefly cover the basic stats that kind of give you a detailed story about their current season, and for the Washington Commanders, it's really bizarre. Offensively, they've been kind of mediocre, scoring the 20th most points per game, the 14th most yards per game, and having the 15th most touchdowns per game. However, despite having a quote-unquote talented defense, they've been arguably one of the worst in the NFL. Defensively, they rank dead last in the NFL in opponents' touchdowns per game, opponents' points per game, opponents' points per play. They also rank 29th in opponents' yards per game and 30th in opponents' yards per play. And there's a lot to dive into with this defense, but I do think I want to backtrack and kind of talk about this offense just a little bit before I start talking about this defense, because what I find really interesting about this offense is that despite having some really talented offensive minds, they don't really seem to trust their backfield, talking about their running backs, because offensively, they rank dead last in the NFL on rush play percentage with a 32.21%, whereas when it comes to their pass play percentage, they rank number 1 in the NFL with 67.79. And what's weird about the fact they rank dead last in their rush play percentage is that they're actually really not that bad at running the football, because they average 4.5 yards per rush, which ranks them 6th highest in the NFL. However, they rank 30th in rushes per game, 25th in rush yards per game, and 15th in rushing touchdowns per game. Now, this can be attributed to a couple different things. For starters, they have been in a lot of shootouts, meaning that they have to pass the ball, and they also don't have the greatest offensive line and running back room to ultimately run the ball a ton. But you would think with a basically rookie quarterback that they would rely on something else besides the pass game, but Ron Rivera's team doesn't like to do that. Now, to give them some credit on the offensive side of things, they're actually not terribly bad at passing the ball. The team has a 66.46% completion percentage, which is the 13th highest in the NFL, and they average 247 yards per game in the passing department, which is the 9th highest in the NFL. But with that being said, they pass the ball a ton, so obviously they throw a lot of interceptions and they get sacked a ton. Their current quarterback sack percentage is 10.17%, which is the 29th highest in the NFL, which brings me to my number 1 point about this offense. Why are we not running the football more? Again, now I understand that this team has gotten into some deficits, but as I mentioned in my intro, they've had some very close matchups. In fact, the only games that they've really had to go out there and pass the ball a ton were against the Buffalo Bills in week 3, where they got dominated 37-3, and then again in their week 5 matchup against the Chicago Bears, where they lost with a score of 40-20, and then of course this most recent week where they basically had to throw the ball a shit ton because they got smoked by the Dallas Cowboys. But in games surrounding those blowouts, they've had some very close matchups. Certain matchups against the Philadelphia Eagles, the Falcons, the Giants, the Patriots have all been really close and have allowed them to run the ball. But despite having these close matchups, they just pass the ball a ton. And sure, Brian Robinson Jr. is not an amazing running back, but I definitely think he's good enough to warrant running the ball. And again, I understand this offensive line is nothing special, but again, you have to run the ball in my opinion. The fact that you have Sam Howell, who like I said earlier, is basically a rookie quarterback out there slinging the ball like he's vintage Tom Brady is ridiculous. And to Sam Howell's credit, he's actually been really good this year, because through 12 weeks, he has 3,339 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. And I'll give the kid some credit. I know he had a bad game against Dallas, but he's played really well in other games. His most impressive matchups have been against the Philadelphia Eagles, and at times he's looked like the quarterback of the future for this team. And I will be completely blunt and honest with you guys. I think he is the future quarterback for this team, especially if they get a head coach and an offensive coordinator who likes to run the ball. I'm sorry, if you give this guy a Ben Johnson who loves to run the ball and run some play action, I think Sam Howell could be a great quarterback, because he's proving in a pass-heavy system that he can be the guy who can sling the ball around and find success. I know that Thanksgiving matchup has left a lot of people with a bad taste in their mouth, and rightfully so, but if you watch his tape and you watch him play this year, he really has not been that bad. Sure, he'll have his occasional game against the Buffalo Bills where he had 170 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 4 picks, but then he'll follow that up with a 151-yard, 3-touchdown game against the Atlanta Falcons. He's a young quarterback who's developing, so it's very expected for him to struggle against good teams, but he's proving that he can be the guy even if it is just a little bit inconsistent right now. And let's be honest, this Commanders team has a ton more issues to address then outside of their quarterback position. For starters, Ron Rivera, please leave. Who do I want to see them hire? Like I said earlier, I think Ben Johnson or Press Taylor or somebody along those lines would be a great addition for this roster. If you want to go on the defensive side of things for a coach, I could understand that too, because as I mentioned earlier, this defense sucks. But I think just because you have a young quarterback in Sam Howell who is still developing, it might be nice to pair him up with a younger, less proven offensive mind to be his head coach. If you are Washington, I think if you look at the situation that just recently happened with the Jacksonville Jaguars, where Trevor Lawrence got his head coach, I think that would be a great move. Hell, as I mentioned, Press Taylor might be available this offseason, so go ahead and get him. Now moving on from their head coach, this team already has a ton of problems that need to be addressed. For starters, the offensive line has to be fixed. They have some small pieces that I think fit here and there, but ultimately it's just not a good unit as a whole. Sam Cosmi at the right guard position has kind of been an interesting development, but I don't think he's a good fit there. They basically need somebody new at almost every position. Like I said earlier, it's not a horrible offensive line. I think a lot of the reasons why they struggle is because they pass the ball a ton, but they're relatively old and ultimately they don't have a lot of talent. They're going to end up with a relatively high draft pick. I would love to see them go out there and take an offensive lineman in this year's draft, as well as open up their pockets to go out there and address the offensive line in free agency. Because if you look at the offense as a whole, you have Sam Howell, you have Terry McLaurin, you have Jahan Dotson, Brian Robinson Jr. is okay, Logan Thomas is about as average as they get at the tight end position, but that's okay. So really on this offense, the one thing that is a major concern is the offensive line. So if you want to address the offensive line in free agency, I think that's a smart move. I'm not sure what big name guys might be out there, and I'm not sure if you really want to go out there and get a bunch of big name guys, but if you can get a bunch of decent starters to go along with 1 or 2 stars along that offensive line this offseason, or at least over the course of the next couple of seasons, that could really fix things up. Again, you have a lot of the pieces you want on offense, you just have to fix the offensive line. As it goes for the defense, for some damn reason, they decided to trade Chase Young and Montez Sweat and got mid-round draft picks. Like, sure, a second-round pick, a third-round pick, that's great, but let's not act like Montez Sweat and Chase Young weren't first-round picks. And sure, they maybe weren't the most productive first-round picks, but they were pretty decent. And the one thing this Commanders team had going for them, especially on the defensive side of things, was they had a good defensive line. You had Chase Young, you had Montez Sweat, you had Daron Payne, you had Jonathan Allen, you had John Ridgeway. That was a good unit. So why did they go ahead and fuck it up? I have no clue. It definitely had to deal with the fact they didn't want to pay these guys, and I can kind of understand that, but when you're looking at a defense that is lacking in talent, why would you trade away the one talented pieces you do have? And sure, the fact you did trade those guys does mean you're going to end up having some more money for next year's free agency. So if they decide not to go out there and spend a ton of money this free agency and they suck again next year, especially along the offensive line, I think trading those guys was basically useless. Now, because they did trade those guys, they're going to have a ton of draft picks. So hopefully for their sake, they can go out there and hit on all their picks, because defensively, they're going to have a stellar draft. Because of their recent trades, they don't really have an edge right now. The middle with Daron Payne and Jonathan Allen is obviously still very good, but when you're starting James Smith-Williams and Casey Toohill, you're not going to be doing very much on the outside. They also should look to address the linebacking core. I do think this is the one position that you can potentially just hold off for right now. Cody Barton and Jamin Davis are okay, and I do think Jabril Cox has some potential, but I don't think any of those guys are necessarily studs. Although I will say Jamin Davis has shown some potentials with 45 solo tackles, 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and 1 interception. So again, I think the linebacking core is something you should address soon, but maybe not this year. Now looking at the secondary, this is a bit more of a stressful conversation. Kendall Fuller has proven to be a very good slot corner. He could even move a little bit to the outside, so I do think you want to bring him back because I do believe he is due for a new contract. St. Juste has been a little bit of an interesting development. I don't think he's anything particularly special, but it's kind of hard to say if it's his problem or if it's the scheme's problem. I do think though he is a part of your long-term plans at that corner spot. Cameron Curl and Percy Butler are very interesting. I'm not a huge fan of Percy Butler myself, but the hard and stressful conversation is really about their first-round pick from this most recent draft, Emmanuel Forbes. This team had a chance to go out there and have a really special draft if you took Christian Gonzalez, but they didn't. They took Emmanuel Forbes. Now, I was never high on Emmanuel Forbes. In fact, I had a 3rd-round grade on him because sure, he has the length and a little bit of the size in terms of the height department, but he did not have the weight. Coming out of college, he was basically a toothpick, and to this day, he's still extremely small. Now, he's had some good moments here and there, but he gets bullied against really big receivers like AJ Brown or CeeDee Lamb. And the problem with this is a division that has some really good quarterbacks and really good receivers. And for Forbes' sake, I don't really know if he's ever going to be the size to compare with those guys. The reason why I wasn't very high on him coming out of college was because I viewed him as a developmental guy. I viewed him as somebody who has the potential to be a Trevon Diggs, but might take some years to get to that point because he is a ball hawk and he does have really good hips and he's fluid with his motion, but he's not big and he needs to develop into his body. He needs to put on weight to become a 200-pound guy, but I don't know if he's ever really going to be able to get to that point, which for somebody who you took in the first round, you have to hit on that pick. And let's be honest, Washington has never really been a very good drafting interesting team. Like I mentioned earlier, they just traded Montez Sweat and Chase Young. And I do believe that Emmanuel Forbes has the talent to one day be a good corner, but for a team that wanted somebody to have an immediate impact, why not take Christian Gonzalez? We saw in the short time Gonzalez is going to be a great cornerback in this league for many years, whereas Emmanuel Forbes isn't even playing right now. Again, I'm willing to hear this draft pick out because I do think he is a developmental guy, but I'm just very concerned about his future and where this team is going to go in that secondary. So what's the consensus on this Washington Commanders team? Well, the consensus is you have your quarterback, but this team has a lot of work to do. For starters, I believe it starts this offseason where you go out there and get a new head coach. I would either take a risk on one of the younger offensive minds, like I mentioned earlier, Ben Johnson or Press Taylor, and I would also look to address the defensive coordinator position because I'm not a big fan of who they have right now. You have to be aggressive in this draft. You have to be aggressive in free agency. I think they have a couple good positions here and there, but they have to address their holes because ultimately those holes they have on their roster are really holding this team back. Having a bad offensive line, having some bad defensive players, it's not helping them at all. I kind of like where this team is going in terms of their future, especially if they do follow some of the things I've mentioned. But if they don't address their problems and they just kind of stick with this current roster and just kind of put some patches here and there, eventually everything will fail for this Washington Commanders team, and I think that's the scariest part. But Commanders fans and NFL fans, let me know in the comment section below what you guys think about this Washington Commanders team. And if you do enjoy NFL and NBA content, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because it helps me out a ton. As well as make sure you share this video to all your friends and family who may also enjoy NFL content. But I love you guys. Peace.